This story is inspired by the real-life journey of Mike Fremont. He was 70 years old, a quiet man with silver-framed glasses and a soul weighed down by too many memories. Cincinnati's spring sunlight poured through his kitchen window, yet inside all felt heavy, breathless wrong. Mike Fremont doubled over in pain. It wasn't unfamiliar. The dull ache had whispered for weeks, but this time it roared. His hand reached for the counter to steady himself. Something deeper than pain curled through his gut: fear. That fear would solidify a few days later beneath the fluorescent lights of a sterile hospital room. The doctor's voice was calm, perhaps rehearsed. "Stage 4, colorectal cancer," he said. "If you don't undergo surgery, you likely have 3 months to live." 3 months. Mike blinked, his mind reaching back across the years like a hand reaching through fog. He'd held a different hand in a different hospital, once hers pale and cold. His wife. Brain cancer had taken her in silence. He had been there until the final breath, the moment the color fled her face like tide receding from shore. Now he was told his own tide was about to turn. Grief, old and new, curled together inside him like vines. At home that evening, the familiar furniture around him felt foreign. The chair she used to sit in, the books they once read. The silence that once was peaceful now throbbed. Death had once taken from him. Now it came knocking again. But amid the fear and sorrow, something else flickered: a tension, a resistance, an almost forgotten ember buried under resignation. Was this truly how it had to end? 3 months of slow unraveling, then a final quiet. He looked in the mirror and did not see a man ready to die. He saw someone who still had questions. Mike agreed to surgery, not out of hope, but necessity. The tumor was removed, but the medical roadmap ahead remained grim. Chemotherapy, radiation, sickness, weakness, nausea, fatigue. He was told this was the path, the only path. But in the days that followed, confined to his home, Mike found himself in a peculiar state of clarity. It was not denial, but intuition. A question pulsed in his mind. What if there was another way? It wasn't born from rebellion or mistrust, but curiosity. His wife had done everything the doctors asked, and still she had slipped away. Mike respected medicine, but he also believed in life, and life had always surprised him. He began reading. Stacks of books: nutrition, immunology, macrobiotics, alternative healing, the relationship between food and inflammation. He stumbled upon stories, quiet stories buried beneath skepticism of people who changed their lives by changing their choices. A radical idea began to form. Maybe healing wasn't always about fighting harder. Maybe it was about listening deeper. He watched interviews, read studies, scribbled notes in a weathered notebook. No animal products, no sugar, no processed oils. Whole foods, plants, simplicity, nature. Not as a diet, but as a way back to something his body might remember. Mike sat alone one evening with a bowl of oatmeal unadorned except for blueberries. Rain tapped against the windows like soft fingers. He took a bite, then another, chewing slowly. The silence wasn't so loud now. It was calm. He began walking, just down the block at first, then to the edge of the park. His legs were stiff, but something in him loosened. He wasn't trying to escape death. He was, for the first time in years, reaching for life. Each step became ritual. Each meal a choice. He didn't know what the outcome would be. But in place of certainty, there was peace. Not the kind that came from surrender, but from alignment. His life, once defined by routine and regret, now felt subtly, powerfully different. A month passed, then 2. He felt better. Not perfect, but undeniably better. The pain no longer woke him. His energy, though modest, was no longer borrowed. He could laugh without wincing. He could breathe without bracing. He returned to the doctor. The scan showed no spreading. The physician was cautious. "It could return," he said. "It often does." Mike nodded. But inwardly he felt something else, a quiet knowing. He was not the same man who had entered that room 3 months ago. He was not waiting to die anymore. He was learning how to live. There was a silence that lingered, not the silence of emptiness, but of decision. After the surgery, Mike Fremont found himself standing at the crossroads of two lives. One followed the well-worn path of aggressive treatment side effects and statistics. The other veered into the unknown, into books, plants, and faith in the body's capacity to heal. He listened carefully to his doctors. Their advice came not from carelessness, but from clinical experience. Chemotherapy, they said, was standard. Radiation offered chances, even if modest. But Mike's instincts stirred with an unexplainable dissonance. He didn't want to spend the little time he had left, if that was to be his fate, in sterile rooms and under chemical warfare. He had seen the cost. His wife had gone through it all. The drips, the pills, the waiting. The long hours stretched in hospital beds while life passed like clouds outside the window. In her last days, she could barely recognize herself. That wasn't the way he wanted to go, not numbed, not ravaged, not diminished. So he chose not to fight in the conventional sense. He chose instead to surrender not to the disease, but to life. That surrender wasn't passive. It was fierce in its own way, radical even. He would give his body everything it needed, not weapons, but tools. Not poison, but nourishment. He began with food. There was something disarmingly simple about brown rice, something honest about lentils. In a world driven by complex solutions, Mike turned to the elemental. He bought oats in bulk. He cleared his fridge of anything that bore a label. He learned to soak beans, steam greens, bake sweet potatoes. His mornings became ritual. He woke early, just before sunrise. The city still slumbered, and in that hush he brewed herbal tea and prepared breakfast with intention. No sugar, no oil, no meat. Just whole grains, fruit, and presence. He read voraciously not only studies but also stories. Real people like him who had changed their health trajectories through food. Some recovered from heart disease, others from diabetes, a few even from cancer. Were they miracles, or merely proof of the body's intelligence when unburdened? Mike didn't claim certainty. He didn't need to. All he needed was a direction that felt alive, and this did. It wasn't just the food. He began to observe how his thoughts shaped his body. He noticed how worry made his breath short, how stillness brought ease. He reconnected with breath deep, deliberate. He found that nature soothed something deeper than fear. Each afternoon he walked. The movement was slow, almost ceremonial. He wore soft shoes and greeted the trees like old friends. The rhythm of walking the cadence of steps offered more than exercise. It was prayer in motion. Neighbors noticed. At first, they asked politely about his health. Then they watched quietly as the color returned to his face. His posture straightened. His eyes, once dimmed by dread, began to carry light. He still had bad days. Fatigue came in waves. But, unlike before, he no longer braced for suffering. He met it like weather unpredictable, impermanent. He no longer lived on the edge of a countdown. Instead, he had turned his gaze inward, not to retreat, but to understand. He stopped watching television. The noise felt foreign. He preferred books' pages. He could underline margins where he could write questions. His house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and roasted squash, the sound of boiling water and turning pages. Mike journaled at night. He wrote not about pain but about presence, not about dying but about being. Some entries were simple. Woke early, saw dew on the window pane, made oatmeal, walked slowly. Others were deeper. What if life isn't about fighting death, but embracing what comes before it fully? He didn't talk much about his choices. When friends visited, they asked about the treatment. Some looked surprised when he said he wasn't doing chemo. Some called him brave. Others reckless. But he smiled and said, "I'm doing what feels right for me." That was the only truth he needed. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, he caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back wasn't the same man from 3 months ago. There were still wrinkles, still gray in the beard. But something else had shifted. There was softness in his expression, steadiness in his spine. He realized he had made peace. Not with dying, but with living on his own terms. He no longer feared what came next. Not because he believed he would live forever, but because he had already begun to live differently, more wholly, more gently, more deliberately, and it all began with a choice not to escape death, but to return to life. A different kind of choice. Healing did not arrive with fanfare. It came in the shape of small habits, soft moments, subtle choices. For Mike Fremont, the transformation began at the most basic level, the plate. He had once thought of food as fuel background noise in the rhythm of his days, but now food became his primary dialogue with life. Each meal was a message, a whisper to his body. I want you to live. There was no grand recipe, no gourmet flair, just whole, unprocessed, unapologetically simple food. He filled his pantry with brown rice, quinoa, dry beans, and oats. He stocked his fridge with kale, cabbage, carrots, and beets. Fruit bowls overflowed with apples, bananas, berries, vibrant, unaltered, alive. He eliminated the foods he once leaned on, red meat, dairy. Refined sugar oils, processed snacks. Not with a sense of loss, but clarity. These were not foods of healing. These were remnants of an old rhythm, a life disconnected from its natural melody. His kitchen transformed into a sanctuary. Chopping vegetables became meditation. Steaming greens felt like devotion. Cooking was no longer a task, it was a ritual repeated in stillness laced with reverence. Mornings began with warm oats topped with flaxseed and blueberries. Midday saw lentil soups, roasted sweet potatoes, giant bowls of steamed greens. Dinner was humble but nourishing, perhaps a stir-fry of vegetables with brown rice or a salad bursting with color and texture. There were no shortcuts, no indulgences, no exceptions. Not because of fear, but because of choice. He was no longer eating to satisfy cravings, he was feeding a miracle in progress. And the body responded. Within weeks, Mike noticed changes not merely on the surface, but in the very fabric of his being. The persistent ache in his abdomen softened, then faded. His sleep deepened. His energy, once rationed and fragile, began to expand. He no longer required naps in the middle of the day. His mind felt less fogged. There was clarity where once there had been a dull haze. Even his skin, once pale and slack, now held a quiet glow. But more than anything, it was the return of vitality that astonished him, not youthful vigor, but something deeper, a steadiness, a quiet power, a renewed sense of presence. The inflammation markers in his blood work began to drop. His digestion improved. He felt light, not just in body, but in spirit. He no longer woke with dread, but with quiet anticipation. Each day felt like a small gift wrapped in simplicity. He read Hippocrates' words in an old book one evening, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." It wasn't a metaphor, it was a blueprint, one that modern life had largely forgotten. The deeper Mike leaned into this way of eating, the more connected he felt not just to health, but to life itself. A sliced apple reminded him of autumn's past. A bowl of lentils spoke of generations before him nourished by the earth. The sweetness of a mango on his tongue evoked awe, not appetite. He started a journal just for food. Not calories, not grams, but gratitude. Lunch, steamed kale, roasted squash, black beans. Felt strong after. Dinner, brown rice with garlic mushrooms and parsley, full of peace. These weren't meals, they were affirmations. There were challenges. Cravings crept in especially in the quiet hours. Memories of warm bread, creamy cheese, salty snacks. But Mike met them with patience like passing clouds. He did not shame himself. He simply returned to what he knew: this food is healing me. When invited to dinners or gatherings, he brought his own food. Not to stand apart, but to stand firm. Some raised eyebrows. Some asked questions. A few rolled their eyes. But others watched, and wondered, and listened. Eventually they asked him, "Do you really feel better?" He answered with a nod, a calm smile, and one sentence: "I feel more alive now than I did in my 40s. Because it was true. This was no fad diet, no temporary fix. It was a reawakening to nature, to simplicity, to the body's astonishing capacity to repair when given space-time and nourishment. Mike found himself reading less about cancer and more about longevity. About blue zones, about centenarians across the globe who lived not just long, but well, all of them sharing something in common: plant-based, whole-food nutrition. He wasn't chasing youth. He was cultivating life. One afternoon, while walking in the park, he paused beside a tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn. He thought about how nature never forced healing. It simply allowed it. With rest, with roots, with rhythm. He whispered to the wind, "Let the body be like this tree, nourished, steady, and resilient." By month's end, his grocery list had become second nature. His cravings had shifted. His taste buds, once dulled by salt and fat, now danced with the sweetness of carrots, the peppery bite of arugula, the earthiness of lentils. Healing, he discovered, wasn't a single moment of triumph. It was a collection of quiet victories, one steamed vegetable, one nourishing bite, one mindful meal at a time. He had not been cured, but he was healing, and that to him was everything. It began as a whisper. Not a voice, not a command, just a quiet tug from within, an urge to move. After months of stillness, of recovery, of choosing life at the table, Mike Fremont stood one morning and felt something different in his body. Not strength exactly, but potential. The sun had only just risen, casting long golden shadows over Cincinnati's sleepy streets. The city was slow to wake, but Mike was already dressed. Loose cotton pants, an old windbreaker, soft shoes that had long gathered dust in the back of the closet. He tied the laces with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the unknown. He didn't call it a run. Not yet. He called it stepping outside. He walked to the end of the block, slowly, mindfully. The air was crisp, and each inhale felt like a cleansing. His body was tentative, unsure, but his spirit was clear. The sidewalk stretched ahead like a possibility, not a threat. Each step was a declaration, "I am still here." That first walk was only 15 minutes, but it was enough. Enough to stir something ancient in his muscles, something buried, but not broken. He returned home with cheeks pink from cold and heart thumping not from exertion but from hope. The next day, he walked a little further, and the day after that a little more. Sidewalks became trails. Street corners became loops. Trees became mile markers. He walked without headphones, without distractions. Just breath, step, breath. He listened to the world, the rustle of leaves, the chatter of birds, the distant hum of morning traffic. And underneath it all, he listened to himself, the body that had once been failing now felt like a companion. Weeks passed. Then came the moment. It wasn't planned. He simply felt his feet move faster than before. The walk turned to a shuffle. The shuffle into a slow jog. His heart surged. His arms swung. He didn't run far, just across a short stretch of park, but when he stopped, hands on knees laughing between breaths, he realized, "I just ran." He was 71. Most people would not begin running at that age. But Mike wasn't most people. He wasn't trying to win races. He was simply outrunning the version of himself who once thought life had ended. Running became his morning ritual. He started reading about gait, posture, breath control. Not obsessively, but respectfully. He honored the process. He learned how to stretch, how to listen for fatigue, how to pace. He kept a modest log time distance feeling. He didn't compare. He celebrated. His neighbors began to notice. There went Mike again. The man who used to walk with a slow gait now moved with surprising rhythm. A few people nodded. Some waved. One elderly couple clapped as he passed. In their eyes, he wasn't just exercising. He was defying expectations. Of course, not every run was graceful. Some mornings the cold bit into his joints. Some days fatigue came early. But Mike had long stopped seeing discomfort as failure. He had learned to treat struggle like weather, something to move through, not against. He found peace in repetition. Left foot, right foot, breath in, breath out. The simplicity was beautiful. Nothing else demanded his attention. No deadlines, no scans, no prognosis, just the present moment pulsing through his body. There were moments when he ran under trees aflame with autumn, the leaves crunching beneath him like applause. Moments when rain painted his jacket and he kept going, feeling more alive than ever. Moments when he reached a hilltop and turned to see the city behind him, the river glinting like silver thread. He wasn't fast, but he was free. Mike began to feel not just well, but strong. His body, once hollowed by disease, now felt responsive, adaptable. He noticed muscles in his calves, new steadiness in his core. His breath deepened. His stride lengthened. But more than anything, his confidence bloomed. He remembered how fragile he had once felt, the sense of waiting for the next shoe to drop. But now he was lacing up his own shoes and writing his own story 1 mile at a time. Running reconnected him to his boyhood, the feeling of chasing the wind, of moving for joy. It wasn't about escaping death anymore. It was about embracing movement, rhythm, life. One morning, he passed a race banner being set up downtown, a local 5K for charity. He paused, watched the volunteers setting cones, pinning numbers. Something stirred. Could he registered that same day. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet promise to himself. Show up. On race day, the crowd was full of runners in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Mike was older than most of their parents. A few people glanced his way, puzzled. But he smiled, stepped to the back of the pack, and waited for the starting signal. The gun went off. Feet thundered ahead. Mike began with a jog, steady and sure. The course wove through neighborhoods he knew well. People lined the streets clapping, cheering. And when he crossed the finish line, not first, not last, but whole, someone handed him a small medal. He looked at it, heart pounding. Breath steady. It wasn't the medal that mattered, it was the message. You chose to begin again. That was the real finish line, not the end of a race, but the end of believing healing had limits. Mike went home that day with tired legs and a soul ablaze. He placed the medal on his windowsill beside a notebook now filled with runs, meals, thoughts, and prayers. And on the final page he wrote, "First I walked, then I ran, but truly I rose. The body remembers." With every stride, every breath, Mike Fremont was reawakening something long dormant, not only the physical strength once assumed lost to time, but the deeper rhythm of persistence, of joy, of motion, woven into the fabric of life itself. Running had started as therapy. Then it became practice. But somewhere along the way, it transformed into purpose. He was now in his mid-70s. Most men his age were warned to rest, to take it easy, to avoid stress on the joints. Mike listened, but not to fear. He listened to his breath. He listened to the steady drumbeat of his feet on the earth. And that drumbeat said, "Go on." Every morning before the world stirred, he tied his shoes and met the road like an old friend. The routes changed sometimes around the city, sometimes along the river, but the ritual was constant. Running was no longer just a means of healing. It had become a form of expression. Each run told a story I chose to live. I continue to choose. He increased his distance gradually, 5 kilometers, then 10. A half marathon, once unimaginable, became a quiet ambition. He didn't chase speed. He chased sustainability, form, focus, breath. And every time he returned home soaked in sweat, he felt cleansed, not only in body, but in soul. Then came a new thought. What if I could go farther? It arrived not as a challenge, but as curiosity. What would it feel like to run a marathon 26.2 miles? The sheer length of it once felt mythical, but now Mike was no longer a man governed by numbers. Age, diagnosis, prediction. None of it dictated his choices anymore. So he trained. He read books written by marathoners half his age. He adapted their strategies, softened their intensity, and designed his own rhythm, one that matched his body's wisdom. He ran 4 days a week, cross-trained with walking and yoga, and learned the sacred art of rest. Nutrition remained central. He continued his whole-food, plant-based meals with the same care as he laced his shoes. Sweet potatoes, legumes, whole grains, greens. No supplements, no protein powders, just food in its most honest form. He ran his first marathon at the age of 80. The race began under a cloudy sky, with hundreds of runners gathered at the start. Mike stood quietly among them wearing a modest bib and a shirt that read simply, "Powered by Plants." There were no cameras waiting for him, no media. But as the miles passed, runners began to notice. The man who ran with steady form. The man who smiled at every mile marker. The man who at 80 years old was outpacing those decades younger. When he crossed the finish line, he wasn't gasping. He was radiant. Not from victory, but from a quiet triumph that only he truly understood. But that was only the beginning. Mike kept running. More marathons followed, each one more proof that the body, when nurtured and listened to, could become stronger with time, not weaker. At 88, he ran a half marathon that broke a world record for his age group. The media began to notice. Interviews followed. Articles, videos. People asked him for secrets for training regimens for miracle routines. But there were no secrets. There was only consistency, nourishment, movement, and love. Love for the process. Love for the body that had once been close to death and now moved like wind over earth. He was invited to speak at plant-based nutrition conferences, health summits, running expos. Always soft-spoken, Mike told his story not to impress, but to inspire. His voice was never boastful. It was calm, clear, and grounded in truth. People often asked him, "What motivates you?" He would pause, then say, "Gratitude. Every run is a thank you. Every mile is a way of saying, I'm still here." In his 90s, he continued to break records, not for fame, but to prove possibility. He ran 5Ks, 10Ks, and half marathons well into his late 90s. He still rose early, still trained, still chose vegetables over pills. His doctors, once skeptical, now called him a medical outlier. But Mike didn't see himself as an exception. He saw himself as a reminder that healing wasn't a destination, but a lifestyle. The medals piled up, but he never displayed them ostentatiously. Most sat in drawers tucked among race bibs and weathered running shoes. He kept them not for pride, but for memory reminders of who he had become. His favorite races were not the ones he won. They were the ones where someone came up after the finish line and whispered, "Because of you, I started running again." Mike often said that the real finish line wasn't on pavement, it was in people's minds. The moment they stopped believing in limitation, the moment they saw that age was not a sentence but a variable that was the true victory. By the time he turned 99, Mike had become a legend in certain circles. Not for athletic prowess, but for clarity. He never wavered, never lost the joy. And on the eve of his 100th birthday, he stood on a start line once more, not for a marathon, but for a short community run. Children ran beside him. Parents cheered. Elderly spectators clapped with tears in their eyes. Mike jogged 1 foot at a time, a light in motion. He crossed the finish line with the same ease as ever, not because he defied age, but because he honored it. Each wrinkle was a mile, each breath a prayer. And as he walked to his car, medal in hand, he looked up at the sky, pale blue, wide open, and whispered to the wind, "We keep going as long as we're blessed to move." Time, they say, is the great equalizer. But for Mike Fremont, time became something else, not an enemy to fight, nor a countdown to fear, but a current to flow with a rhythm to embrace. He turned 90, not with quiet resignation, but with steady feet and a beating heart. While others around him were slowing down, folding into caution, Mike laced up his running shoes each morning with a prayer of motion. Not for speed, not for applause, but because his body still asked for the road. And he listened. His days remained simple. Oatmeal in the morning, long walks along the river, runs when the weather allowed. He ate from the earth lentils, greens, potatoes, fruit, grains. No sugar, no oil, no meat, no medication. Yes, no medication. At an age when pharmacies often become lifelines, Mike's cupboards held nothing more than herbs and dried beans. His doctors, puzzled but delighted, reviewed his charts again and again. No high blood pressure, no cholesterol issues, no diabetes, no signs of inflammation. They called him an anomaly. But Mike did not see himself that way. He wasn't trying to outlive anyone. He was simply living in alignment with nature, with his choices with the body that once warned him it was shutting down and now sang quietly with resilience. He never kept a rigid schedule, but his days followed a rhythm. A walk in the morning sun, meals prepared slowly, eaten mindfully, a nap if his body asked. Some days he ran. Other days he paddled a kayak across the water, watching the shoreline blur in reflection. Movement remained his medicine. Not punishing workouts. Not striving. Just daily intentional motion. He believed deeply that the body needed to be in motion to remain in harmony, like rivers, like seasons, like breath itself. What surprised many was not just his physical endurance, but the sharpness of his mind. At 92, he still read books with pencil in hand, underlining passages, jotting thoughts in margins. He journaled daily. He wrote about gratitude, about aging, about stillness. He laughed more. He said laughter was its own kind of running, a quickening of spirit. He no longer measured time in birthdays. He measured it in sunrises, in bowls of soup, in the crunch of gravel beneath his feet. He had stopped asking, how many years, and started asking how fully today people began to ask him to speak. At wellness retreats, at medical conferences, on small stages, and in local libraries. Mike never carried notes. He carried presence. He stood straight with eyes clear and voice calm, and spoke of simplicity. He never pushed his lifestyle onto others. He simply told his story: cancer at 70, recovery through food and movement marathons in his 80s, freedom in his 90s. He spoke not like a man trying to sell hope, but like one who had lived it into being. Often after his talk, someone would approach a man in his 60s with a tired gaze, a woman in her 50s recovering from chemotherapy, a young runner looking for purpose, and they would ask, "Is it too late?" Mike would smile, not with pity, but with knowing. "It's never too late to turn toward life," he would say, and then he would add, almost as a whisper, "But don't wait." As he approached his 100th year, the world began to notice. News outlets ran features. Headlines marveled at the centenarian runner. But behind the spotlight was the same man, quiet, disciplined, grateful. He didn't care for fame. He cared for the message. That age is not decay. That health is not luck. That longevity is not a miracle. It is the compounding of daily choices shaped by integrity and care. At 98, he ran a timed 5K, not as fast as before, but steady, graceful, strong. He crossed the finish line and waved to the small crowd, then hugged a child who had made a sign, "Go Mike." He knelt beside the boy and said, "Running isn't about winning, it's about becoming." His home remained modest. Walls adorned with race bibs, a bookshelf sagging under the weight of worn cookbooks, shoes lined up by the door. A single photo of his late wife on the mantel, her eyes soft, her smile eternal. He said she would have laughed at all the attention, but she would have understood the journey. Mike often said aging wasn't about resistance, it was about release. Letting go of the story that growing old must mean growing weak. Letting go of labels. Letting go of fear. At 99, he ran his final official race before the century mark. A short 1-mile community run. The town came out for him, children, families, nurses, runners he had unknowingly inspired. They didn't cheer for a record. They cheered for a man who had redefined what was possible. He crossed the finish line and lifted both hands, not in victory but in thanks. A few days later, he turned 100. No cake, no candles, just oatmeal with blueberries. A morning walk. A few letters from strangers thanking him for saving their lives. And in his journal he wrote, "I am not here because I am extraordinary. I am here because I honored the ordinary things, food, breath, movement, and love every day without fail. Age has not defeated me. It has refined me." The races had ended, at least the official ones. But for Mike Fremont, life had never been about the finish line. Not really. It had always been about what happened after the quiet unfolding of days, the spaces between applause, the sacred rhythm of ordinary hours. He had turned 100, and in the stillness of that milestone, nothing dramatic occurred. There was no transformation, no great announcement. Instead, there was oatmeal, warm, familiar, gently sweetened by berries. There was the morning light spilling through the kitchen window, touching the wooden table like an old friend. There was the same breath, steady and deep, the same quiet presence. Mike had lived long enough to know that life's most profound gifts were rarely loud. His body, still slender, still upright, no longer demanded marathons. But it did ask for movement. Gentle walks, occasional short jogs, stretches by the garden. He listened as always. He had nothing left to prove and everything left to enjoy. No medication lined his shelves. No bottles with difficult names. His pulse remained steady, his blood pressure enviable, his eyes clear behind modest glasses. He saw his doctors once a year more as a courtesy than necessity. They called him a living miracle. He smiled and said nothing. He knew it was not a miracle. It was a lifestyle. His days followed a quiet script. He rose early, always with intention. He began with breathwork, slow and grounding. A cup of warm herbal tea followed. Sometimes chamomile, sometimes ginger. Then breakfast oats or millet flax seeds fruit. Always whole. Always plant-based. The morning was for movement. A walk through the neighborhood where trees leaned like old companions. Sometimes he'd paddle his kayak across a nearby lake, slicing through mist like a monk on water. The rhythm calmed him. It always had. Afternoons were slower. He read. He tended to his small vegetable patch. He wrote in a notebook, not about pain, not about the past, but about wonder. The shape of a leaf. The way birds circled before rain. The taste of perfectly ripe persimmon. He kept his meals simple. No oil, no sugar, no excess. Just whole, real food that nourished without noise. Dishes of lentils, steamed greens, squash brown rice. Sometimes he added fresh herbs from the garden: basil, rosemary, mint. Food was not just sustenance. It was a daily conversation with the body. Evenings were his favorite. The world slowed. The shadows softened. He would light a single lamp, read a few pages, or sit in silence. Sometimes he would play soft classical music. Sometimes he would just listen to the crickets. No television, no rush, no urgency. He was not lonely. The solitude had matured into companionship. He had himself, and he had peace. Visitors came occasionally. A neighbor, a young athlete inspired by his story, a curious journalist, a doctor seeking insight. He welcomed them with warmth, but never with spectacle. They often left with more than they expected, not information, but a feeling that life could be simpler and richer. They would ask how he did it, what his secret was. He would shrug lightly and say, "I never stopped listening to my body. I never stopped honoring what was natural." And it was true. He had not followed fads. He had not obsessed over supplements. He had not chased performance. He had simply returned to movement, to plants, to breathe, to presence. Again and again. He had outlived friends, outlived predictions, outlived the version of himself who once believed the story was over. But he did not mourn time. He greeted it like an old rhythm. He once said, "Age isn't something to defeat. It's something to dance with." On his quiet desk sat 3 objects. 1. A photo of his late wife, serene, smiling eyes filled with knowing. 2. A race medal from his last marathon. Not for glory, but as a marker of grace. 3. A stone from the river trail, smooth and weathered, picked up on the day he chose to live again. Sometimes he would run his fingers over that stone, not to remember, but to feel. The weight of choice, the coolness of surrender, the permanence of change. He no longer kept a calendar filled with plans. He moved with the seasons, planted when the soil called, rested when the body asked, gave when his heart opened. He did not fear death. He had walked beside it once, had made peace with its breath. What he feared, if anything, was not living fully, and that fear had long been silenced. He believed that longevity was not a matter of years, but a matter of depth. He had lived a second life not by accident, but by alignment. Not by fighting fate, but by choosing flow. And now, at over 100 years old, he stood not as a monument, but as a living garden. Rooted, quiet, blooming. One evening, as the sky turned honey and rose, he sat by his open window. The wind stirred the curtains. In his lap was a bowl of berries. In his chest, a steady heart. In his mind, a single thought. This is the finish line. And it is only the beginning. A stone cast into still water does not disappear. It creates ripples, concentric circles of movement, subtle at first, then far-reaching. Mike Fremont's life was such a stone, not thrown in fury, but placed with intention. And the ripples, though quiet, changed lives. He never sought to be a symbol, never imagined his name would travel across border screens or lecture halls. He had simply chosen to live differently, and in doing so had given others permission to do the same. The first letters came in ones and twos. Notes slipped under his door. Emails from distant cities. Messages scribbled on the back of race bibs. Your story gave me courage. Because of you, I started running again. I changed how I eat. And I feel alive. He kept each one. Stacked in a shoebox by his reading chair, they reminded him that choices once private could become contagious, that quiet conviction could become collective change. Invitations followed, not to races, but to speak, at schools, at wellness summits, at plant-based nutrition conferences. Mike was never a polished orator, but he didn't need to be. His story was his speech. He spoke slowly, standing tall in his plain sweater and walking shoes eyes gentle behind clear lenses. There was no performance, only presence. He told them about the diagnosis, about the shift, about the food, the movement, the miracles disguised as routine. He never promised healing, never offered certainty. He simply extended an example. One life turned inward, then outward. After each talk, people lined up, not for autographs but for assurance. They wanted to stand near him, to believe what he believed, that it wasn't too late, that their story could still change. He met each one with the same quiet affirmation. You don't have to be extraordinary, just consistent. Researchers began to take interest. Articles were published. His health records, baffling in their simplicity, were cited in journals. Physicians called him a case study in longevity. But Mike shrugged off the spotlight. He was never chasing science. He was living truth. Athletes visited him. Vegan bodybuilders, plant-based marathoners, teenage track stars. They didn't come for advice, they came for grounding. They came to see that strength could live quietly, that power could age with grace. Mike became a thread connecting movements, the wellness world, the longevity crowd, the minimalist lifestyle seekers, the chronic illness warriors. And at the center of it all was a man who still walked every morning, still journaled before bed, still cooked his lentils one slow scoop at a time. One documentary filmmaker spent weeks with him capturing his daily rhythm. The garden, the kayak, the oatmeal, the laughter, the long pauses between sentences. The film would later be screened at festivals and streamed online to thousands. In one scene, Mike stands barefoot in his backyard holding a tomato still warm from the sun. He smiles and says, "It's not the years you add to your life. It's the life you add to your years." Those words traveled far, quoted in podcasts, printed on posters, tattooed on the wrists of people he'd never meet. The ripple had become a wave, but through it all, Mike remained unchanged. He never saw himself as a teacher. He called himself a witness, a man who had once faced the end and instead chose the middle, the rich, unfinished, open middle. He refused to sell products, refused to endorse trends. He said healing had no price tag, that it began with stillness, with a decision, with a bowl of whole grains, with the first walk around the block. He gave interviews reluctantly, but when he did speak, he reminded listeners that no one was beyond redemption, that the body given space would lean toward life, and he reminded them again and again to begin wherever they were, with what they had, to listen, to move, to simplify, to reclaim. He wrote a letter once meant not for the present, but for the future. It was tucked in a journal later found after his passing. It read, "To the one who is tired, afraid, or lost. I was there too. I faced the quiet edge of my life and I chose to walk backward into light, not all at once, but step by step. Let today be your first. You do not need to run a marathon. You only need to take the next breath. That is where healing lives." It was unsigned, but it didn't need a name. By then, the ripple had outgrown the stone. Mike's influence was never about fame. It was about returning to the body, to the earth, to the moment. He showed people how to listen again, how to trust food that grows from soil, how to honor silence, how to wake each morning not with dread, but with awe. He never claimed to have the answers, only his answer. And that answer had echoed into kitchens, into running trails, into hospitals and quiet bedrooms where someone sat alone and afraid until they remembered Mike Fremont and began again. Evening always came gently for Mike Fremont. There was no rush in the wind, no urgency in the trees, just light dimming, slowly, softly, like a curtain drawn by invisible hands. In these final years, Mike moved not as a man chasing time, but as someone in harmony with its rhythm. He no longer ran races, yet every day he walked a familiar trail by the water, slow, steady, full of breath. The gravel beneath his feet sang a song he had followed for decades, not of speed, but of presence. His back was slightly bent now, his gait more careful, but his eyes still held the same quiet fire, the kind that came not from youth, but from depth, from years lived with awareness, from choices made in alignment, from healing chosen every single day. He no longer feared the end. He welcomed it as one welcomes twilight, not as darkness, but as a softening, a return, a homecoming. People sometimes asked what legacy he hoped to leave. He never spoke of medals or articles of records or awards. He would say gently, "If one person chooses to listen to their body, if one person walks instead of giving up, if one person eats with care, breathes with peace, forgives themselves, and begins again, then I've done enough." In the final autumn of his life, Mike spent long hours near the lake watching light ripple across water geese cutting slow arcs across the sky. He carried a small notebook, though he rarely wrote in it anymore. It was enough to witness. One afternoon he sat beneath a maple tree, the leaves aflame in gold and rust. His breath was slow. His hands rested in his lap. A young runner jogged past, paused, and turned. "Are you Mike Fremont?" Mike smiled the same way he had smiled for a century. "I am," he said. The young man nodded, eyes glistening. "You helped me. Start over." Mike didn't reply. He only reached out, touched the runner's shoulder, and said, "Keep going." And then the runner was gone, footsteps fading into the path ahead, and Mike remained beneath a sky of molten color, the river whispering beside him. In that moment, nothing more was needed. Not words, not witnesses, just the wind, the trees, the body still breathing, and the story still echoing. Mike Fremont, the Sunset Runner, had not outrun death. He had simply chosen again and again to live.